Welcome. Hi, I'm Dr. Liz Watts-Maluhos, and I'm a research archaeologist at the Illinois State Archaeological Survey. I'll be the moderator for today's lecture. On behalf of the Illinois State Archaeological Survey and my co-organizer, Dr. Erin Benson, welcome again, and thank you for joining us this afternoon. We are really excited to continue our speaker series, The Intersections of Indigenous Archaeology, or Indigenous Knowledge and Archaeology, with a lecture by Diane Hunter today. This series is being supported by funds from the Office of the State Archaeologists and the Student Cultural Programming Fee. Before we get started, let's take care of a little business. Participants, as you know, since you've joined, will remain muted and with the videos off during the duration of the lecture, but you can submit questions to me directly at any time using the Zoom chat function, and a question and answer discussion will follow the lecture as time allows. As I said before, my name is Liz, and I work out of the Illinois State Archaeological Survey's American Bottom Field Station in Collinsville, Illinois. The survey, also referred to as ISAS, is a division of the Prairie Research Institute at the University of Illinois. With about 70 full-time archaeologists and support staff working throughout the state, ISAS is one of the largest archaeological research institutions in the US. ISAS is dedicated to the preservation and interpretation of the archaeological and architectural remains in what is now the state of Illinois. I've had the great fortune to work with Diane through Indiana University, and I am thrilled to be hosting her now at the University of Illinois. On behalf of the state archaeologist and the director of ISAS, Dr. Timothy Paketat, today we are honored to host Diane Hunter. Before I continue, I would like to recognize that the university and ISAS are located on the ancestral homelands of several tribes. We recognize and acknowledge that we are on the lands of the Peoria, the Kaskaskia, Piankashaw, Weya, Miamiaki, Mascoutin, Odawa, Meskwaki, Sauk, Kickapoo, Potawatomi, Ojibwe, Chickasaw, and other nations. These lands were the traditional territory of these Native nations prior to their forced removal, and these lands continue to carry the story of these nations. This acknowledgement and the centering of Native peoples is a start as we move forward. Now I would like to introduce UIUC's Vice Chancellor of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, Dr. Sean Garrick.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us. I think we have a fantastic lecture ahead of us this afternoon. I won't tell you that much about myself. I'll just simply say that it's my role, the purpose of my office, to use the transformational power of the university to lead our campus towards an increasingly diverse and inclusive community that is open, just, and welcoming for all. And I think today's events really reflects how we may seek to do that. Diane Hunter, she is the Tribal Historic Preservation Officer for the Miami tribe of Oklahoma, and she's also a citizen of the tribe. She is a descendant of the Miami family, Secauceta, Palancha, Francois Godfroy, through her son, Wapanaki Kapwa, Gabriel Godfroy. Her work as Tribal Historic Preservation Officer involves preserving and protecting the historic sites and resources, providing education about the presence and history of the Miami tribe, as well as serving 800 tribal citizens in Indiana and surrounding areas. The Miami Tribal Historic Preservation Office is committed to the perpetuation of historic properties and the cultural knowledge tied to them. Diane was born in Indianapolis, Indiana, and she grew up in Wabash County in north central part of the state. She has a bachelor's degree from Indiana University and a master's degree from Ball State University in Georgetown. Diane's commitment to education precedes her tenure with the tribe, as she worked as a librarian in reference services and teaching at the George Washington University, also at the Georgetown University and Ball State University, and University of Missouri, Kansas City. For over 30 years in university libraries, quite extensive experience. She began work for the Miami tribe in 2015, when the tribe purchased property in Fort Wayne and opened the Cultural Resources Extension Office. Diane, thank you very much for bringing your experience and expertise with us, and I look forward to your lecture. Thank you.
Now tell me that you can see my screen properly.
Yes, we can.
Okay, good. And thank you for that introduction. And thank you for your pronunciation of our tribal names. You did an excellent job. So I thank you for that. Aya, tepewe neola kakoke, wahanungi kakikwe. Checha kokwa wenzwiane, nilamita semia miamiquia. Seka kweta ne palanzwa alampakasiane. I just said hello, greeted you in the Miami language, Miamiaki Wenge. And I said that I am a citizen of the Miami tribe of Oklahoma and a descendant of Sekakweta and Palanzwa, who are also known as the Godfroys. And I am honored to serve my nation as Tribal Historic Preservation Officer. Today, I want to talk about our history as Miami people, and also about our tribe today, and pulling in some connections to things that hopefully, as archaeologists, will be important for you to know. But I always find it best to begin at the beginning. Mitame, Miamiaki, Nipengonje, Sakachuecheke. At first, the Miami came out of the water. That's the first line of our oldest story. It's the story of our emergence as Miami people. We came from the north, we believe, based on some of our other stories, but we don't know where we came from or who we came from. But when we came out of the water, we were a distinct and unique people who came to be called Miamiaki, Miami people. The story goes on to tell us that we grabbed hold of branches and pulled ourselves out of the water and established a village. And then over time, we began to leave that village. And then one person came back and he was surprised to find other people living there. And not only that, that they spoke the same language that we did. And so that was the story of our origin. Now, I usually start my talks with this older story, but I particularly wanted to tell it today for you because this is part of our history that is often left out of the cultural background portion of an archaeological report. And as far as we are concerned, it is a very important part of our history. So when we came out of the water, we started a village which we called Sakiweonge. The river that we came out of was the St. Joseph River, or we called it Sakiwe Sipiwe. But it was somewhere between Lake Michigan and what is today South Bend, Indiana, that we came out of the water. And that's where we lived for a period of time. We don't know for how long. But after a while, we began to leave, as the story tells us. But what the story does say is, or tells us, that we have been in what is now Indiana, Illinois, and surrounding areas since time immemorial. This is our homeland. The first group to leave Sakiweonge ended up in what has come to be called Kikayonge, in present-day Fort Wayne, Indiana. Another group went to the area that now has Fort Meigs, Ohio. And then there was a group, a band led a group to Waiatononge, right down here, Waiatononge. And that came to be the place where the French built Fort Ouiatenon. You can tell Ouiatenon, Waiatononge, it was the French way of pronouncing our name for that place. And so there was a group that lived here, but eventually a group split away from there and they went to the confluence of the Wabash and Vermilion rivers. And there was a village there. And then another group broke off and established a village near Vincennes, Indiana. And So the group that came to Waiatanonge came to be known as the Uiuc. And the group that broke off from there are the Piankashaw. The group that was living here of Piankashaw, eventually some Kaskaskia came and joined them and intermarried with them and became one people eventually. Although those that had intermarried eventually left and came back into what is now Illinois, and from them came the Peoria. Now, if you heard Logan Pappenfort's talk last week, you heard some of this, and I'm not trying to take their story, except to point out that up to this point, we have a common story, a common history with the Peoria tribe of today. So as I said, we were living in this area since time immemorial. And then we had our first contact with Europeans. And that came by way of disease and trade goods that got passed from one tribe to another. And that happened long before we ever saw a European white face. And the first time that we did, we were frightened by them and they were frightened by us. And that was on Lake Huron. And that was in the mid 1600s. And around that same time were the Beaver Wars. And during the Beaver Wars, the Iroquois were coming west, and there was a lot of fighting, war, obviously, and we just wanted to get out of the way. We did not want to be a part of this war. And so at that point, we left most of our villages here and came into what is now Illinois and north into what is now Wisconsin. And it was near Green Bay that we first encountered French after that first frightening interaction. And that's where we started interacting with them, with the French traders and with the French Jesuit missionaries. Now, by the early 1700s, we were back in our villages in what is now Indiana, and some in Illinois, some in Ohio. These villages that I'm showing here on the map are not all our villages. They're just the ones that are most commonly known about today. Now, once we came back into our homelands, that's when we started trading with the French some more. Not just, we didn't leave them behind when we left Wisconsin and Illinois, but we continued to trade with them. And this is the point where most archaeologists begin to include Miamiaki, Miami people, in their cultural background reports. The assumption is that we began as a people in present day Illinois and Wisconsin, and then entered now Indiana in the early 1700s after the Great Peace of Montreal. It seems that only Euro-American accounts of us are considered valid enough to use as source material for our history. Our stories that predate our first contact with Europeans are apparently not good enough to include. Now, I'll grant you, archaeologists may not know about our stories, but that is exactly why it's important to consult with the tribes, even on the cultural background. And frankly, it should be taught in university archaeology programs to consult with tribes and to get that information from the tribes rather than from secondary history books that don't know the details of much of our history. But unfortunately, what we know about ourselves is often not considered as good as what Euro-Americans think they know about us. So, coming back to Indiana, we're trading with the French, and by the mid-1700s, we're also trading with the British. And then there was the Treaty of Paris, 1763, and the French ceded our land to the British. Now, the French understood that what they had was trading rights, diplomatic rights with us. They understood that they didn't own the land. Now, I'm not clear what the British thought they got from the French, but in the Treaty of Paris, 1783, which of course ended the American Revolutionary War, The British transferred claim to that area to the Americans, and it was pretty clear that the Americans thought the land was theirs. Now, we had never given away our land, we had never traded our land, we had never sold our land, and we were not at all a part of either the Treaty of Paris in 1763 or in 1783. So it was still our land. But the Americans came west anyway, and in increasing numbers. And that led to skirmishes and attacks on both sides. Well, you can imagine if someone came to your land, to your home, to your own personal property, and cut down your trees and started building houses on your property, you'd want to do something. You want to stop it. You want justice. And the only way that we were going to get justice was to get people off the land. But that didn't work. It ultimately led to war. And I'm not going to go into the details of war. I'm not a military historian, but I'll just tell you a little bit about what we think is important about that. There were several significant battles, but the most insignificant for us was St. Clair's defeat in 1791. And it is still to today the greatest casualty defeat of the US Army ever. So to us, this is a decisive battle. We are able to send them running. We killed a large number of them in the battle, and we were successful. But only 3 years later, they came back and we lost at the Battle of Fallen Timbers in 1794. And we realized it doesn't matter how successful we are in these battles, they always have more men to come back and fight more. We don't have any more. We have the number of people that we have, and that's all. And when they're killed, we can't go somewhere and replace them. We also realized that even when we won the battles, the Americans burned our fields and burned our villages. And so we were sustaining great losses, even in victory. And so that was why we agreed to go to the Treaty of Greenville in 1795. And that was the first treaty that Miamiaki, Miami people, signed with the Mishimal-Sake, the Americans. This was going to be good. They had their land, we had our land. We were going to be good neighbors. But it didn't work out quite that way because the Americans kept coming further and further in, and they wanted more and more land. Now you can see here, this is that map of Miamiaki, our land, and the pink will be lands that we cede in the treaties. So this is what we ceded in the Treaty of Greenville. At this point, mostly Ohio and a few pieces in Indiana and Illinois, Chicago. But then, yeah, they wanted more land and they wanted more treaties to get that land. And so after the Treaty of Greenville, there was a treaty in 1805 and in 1809. And so there's what is now southern Indiana that was ceded. And in fact, this is what was Indiana when it became a state in 1816, because the rest of this up here was still our land. But then there were more treaties. The Treaty of, back one. Treaty of 1818, a huge chunk out of the middle of the state and the state capital of Indianapolis was able to be founded after the Treaty of 1818. And then the Treaty of 1826, and by this time, most of the state is gone, just some small pieces of tribal communal land was left. 1834, 1838. Now all we have is this yellow patch in the middle of the pink called the Great Miami Reserve. And then came the Treaty of 1840. And in 1840, we agreed to exchange the Great Miami Reserve for what was supposed to be about the same amount of land west of the Mississippi River. Most significantly, however, we agreed to be removed to that land west of the Mississippi. Now, we didn't want to go. This was our homeland. This is where we had lived our lives. This is where our parents and our grandparents had lived. This is where our ancestors were buried. We did not want to leave this land. And though we agreed in 1840 to leave within 5 years, we kept putting it off. And we can't go now because we need to harvest our crops. And we can't go now because we need to sell our land. And we just kept putting it off and putting it off. Until in October 1846, which by the way is 175 years ago this year, the US Army came and they started rounding us up from our villages and taking us to a camp, a secure camp in Peru, Indiana. So they're bringing us from all of this area right down here to Peru and holding us there. Now, when some people, especially those in Wawayasitas and Pepaquiches bands, when they heard that the American Army was coming, they fled north and went north to join the Pokagon Potawatomi, who were in southern Michigan. And many of them fled, but not all of them. Some of them, for whatever reason, did not run away. But they gathered everyone that they could and got to Peru. And then they loaded us on canal boats. The Wabash and Erie Canal had been completed just a few years, well, just a year earlier. And so they boarded us on the canal boats, and more than 300 Miamiaki were taken on 5 canal boats on the canal. We went past many, many familiar places. We went past Kikayonga at what is now Fort Wayne. We went into what is now Ohio, and we passed Pingwawaleneonge near Piqua, Ohio, which had been a village of ours previously. We followed the canal all the way to Cincinnati. Now, this is a picture of Cincinnati in 1848. So this is less than 2 years after we arrived there. And you can imagine it looked pretty much like this when we arrived. We arrived on the canals and then were marched, as the report said, down Main Street to the public landing to the steamboat Colorado. Now, neither of these is the Colorado to my knowledge, but these would have been very similar to the steamboat Colorado. I'd like to show you what was in the newspapers on the day that we arrived and left from Cincinnati. This is in the Cincinnati Gazette, October 13th, 1846. Daily receipts by the Miami Canal: 134 barrels of whiskey, 218 barrels of flour, 10 sacks of 115 pounds of wool, 8 barrels of varnish, 2 Indian ponies, Miami Indians, 225 over and 78 under 8 years old, 49 perch stone, 4 pigs, and so on and so on. And shipments to St. Louis by the Colorado: 30 tons of dry goods, 32 casks of government stores, 350 Indians with their baggage. We were not passengers on these boats. We were cargo. There was a passenger list for the steamboat Colorado, but we were not listed on it. So we took the steamboat Colorado down the Ohio River. Those of you who are familiar with Angel Mounds, we would have gone right past Angel Mounds on the Ohio to the Mississippi River, where we headed towards St. Louis. Now, on October 18, we had our first death. It was a baby. The child's mother was from Wawayasitas band. And I think about her a lot. I imagine this mother sitting on the boat, holding her dead baby. I imagine she must have been thinking, why didn't I flee with the rest of them? Why did I get on this boat? If I had fled, maybe my baby would still be alive. But there she was, holding her dead baby, waiting to bury him. 2 days later, on October 20th, there was a second death. This time it was an elder man named Ottawa. And that same day, we arrived at St. Louis, but they didn't take us into St. Louis. They put us on Bloody Island, which was in the Mississippi River. It was a sandbar on the Illinois side, and that's where they kept us. And that's where, as Sinclair, the Indian agent who was with us, described as our peculiar way, we buried the Wauwiasata infant and Ottawa. And then we waited for 3 days. The steamboat Colorado was far too large to go on the very shallow Missouri River, and so they had to find a new boat for us. And so we just waited on Bloody Island until they found the Clermont II, and we started out again. While we're on the Missouri River, there are 4 more deaths, all children. All totaled, there were 7 deaths en route to our new location west of the Mississippi. The steamboat Clermont II took us to the Kansas Landing, also known as the Westport Landing, in the town of Kansas, which is today Kansas City. The next morning, we walked from the town of Kansas south to our new reservation on Sugar Creek. It was an early, unusually cold winter, and it was a very hard winter for us. They had plenty of time to build houses for us because they were pushing us to come, but they didn't. There were no houses. We had to live in government issue tents. And we had to eat government issue food because it's November. We can't grow any crops. And the food that we would normally have found during this time of year at home are either not present at all or not in sufficient amounts for us to eat. By Christmas that year, since we left on October 6th to Christmas of 1846, at least 30 people had died. That's almost 10% of those who went on removal. But spring came, and we began building houses and schools and businesses to create a better life for our children. And life was better. We had a good life for a while. And then, well, American squatters came onto our land, our tribal land, and ultimately our own individually owned land, even though from the very beginning, when the US started talking to us about going west of the Mississippi, they promised they would keep white people off our land, but they didn't. And they had great difficulty getting them off of our land. Also, when Kansas became a state, they, being a new state, needed money, and they thought it would be a good idea to take over our lands and into the state of Kansas and tax it. You can't do that. It's not, it's our land, it's tribal land, it's not US land. But we still had to fight with it, and we had to deal with it. And then, of course, in the early 1860s, we've got the Civil War. And I don't know what you teach in Illinois, but in Indiana, they certainly did not teach about the Civil War in Missouri and Kansas. But the Civil War was being fought right there on the Missouri-Kansas border. And we are just across the Kansas border. And the Missouri bushwhackers who are trying to extend slavery into Kansas are coming across, they're coming through our villages, and we were terrified. Our women were our farmers, and they were afraid to go out in the fields because of the bushwhackers coming through. So things were really not good for us for a while there. And then after the Civil War, the government wanted us to move to Indian Territory, which is today Oklahoma. And things were so bad in Kansas, the tribe agreed to go. And so the tribe moved to northeastern Oklahoma. You can see, you've seen the other maps, you know how big Oklahoma is. This is our part of our land, a reservation which we shared with the Peoria. We had come from what it constitutes more than 3 states today, down to a very small portion of land. So the tribe went west. But a few families were allowed to stay in what is now Indiana, well, by then was Indiana, by treaties or by legislation. And then there were others who had gone on removal, but were allowed to go back and harvest their crops, sell their land, whatever they thought they needed to do. And then they were rounded up again and taken back to Kansas. And then they came back to Indiana. So there were a few families that were back and forth and a few families that just remained in Indiana. And from those families, there are 800 citizens of the Miami tribe of Oklahoma who are descendants of those families. For most of the 20th century, the families in Indiana were not able to be part of the Miami tribe of Oklahoma. But in 1996, the tribe changed the enrollment rules. And so now today, we Indiana Miami are also able to be part of the Miami tribe of Oklahoma. So the results of our removal is in part that we're a divided people. We have 3 population centers, primarily in Miami, the town of Miami, Oklahoma, where our tribal government is seated, in the area where our Kansas reservation was, and in northeastern Indiana. But in reality, we have Miami people living in all 50 states today. So we are definitely a divided people. And what happens when we're divided and we're surrounded by people of other cultures is that we begin to assimilate to those other cultures, and then we lose a lot of our own culture. And one of those things that we lost was our language. Our last native speakers of the language died in the 1960s, 1970s. Now, there were a few who could speak some, but the fluent speakers were gone. So let me talk a little bit about the Miami tribe today. As I said, we are in the town of Miami, Oklahoma, in Ottawa County, northeastern Oklahoma. By our Constitution from 1939, the General Council is our governing body. And the General Council is everyone 18 years and older who comes to the annual meeting and votes. And we vote for our leaders who are going to carry out the day-to-day governmental business of the tribe. And so this is our current leadership. The gentleman in the bright yellow shirt in the middle is our current chief, Doug Langford. And when we vote for these leaders, it's not just we vote for you and you then make your own decisions. We tell our leaders what we want. These are the things that we want to see happen. And it's their obligation to find a way to make it happen. And that is very traditionally Miami. That's the way a chief has always been. He's been a servant leader there to serve the will and the needs of his people. And that's what we carry on today. We are a sovereign nation. We provide services for our citizens. We have a police force. For those that live in Oklahoma, instead of getting an Oklahoma license plate, they can get a Miami Tribe license plate for their vehicles. Miami Nation Enterprises is the political economic subdivision of the tribe. The tribe has a diverse portfolio, and we have companies that make cabinetry and countertops and do contracting and software development. We own Ohio Ambulance. We have the only movie theater in Miami, Oklahoma, and we have a restaurant and 2 casinos in Miami. And from those resources, we are able to provide for our citizens and to do the cultural resources, the cultural activities, and the cultural development that we are able to do in the tribe. We have gatherings for our citizens under normal circumstances. We do have our annual meeting, although last year it was very much reduced to just a 2-hour meeting when we did our elections and take care of business, and we all went home. But normally that annual meeting, we have a lot of activities and educational activities and fun activities and games, and then we have other gatherings. We usually have a winter gathering, which this year was online. But the highlight of our winter gathering is storytelling. And a lot of our stories were written down around the turn of the 20th century. And some of them actually were written down in Miamiaki, the Miami language. Most of those stories are winter stories. And winter stories are more, they have non-human actors in them, non-human characters, and they sometimes can do things that humans cannot do. And these stories are called winter stories because they can only be told in the winter. We can begin telling winter stories in the fall when the frogs stop croaking and we have the first hard frost. And then we start storytelling. And in the spring, when the frogs start croaking again, and we have the first big thunderstorm, so we are now past winter storytelling time. We can no longer tell those stories. We put down the thread of storytelling until the following winter. Now, we also have historical stories. The story that I told you about at the beginning of my talk is an historical story. It is a true story about real people in real places. And those stories we can tell at any time. They aren't necessarily just winter stories. But it's very fun to tell these stories, and it's something that has been revived in our tribe. You see that the storytellers here in the images, they're all young. Traditionally, stories would be told by the elders to the young people, but unfortunately, when the language went to sleep, so did the stories. And now the young people are learning them and telling them. And they will be telling them till they are the elders telling the stories to the young people. So yeah, our language went to sleep, and linguists will tell you that our language was dead. And when a language is dead, it cannot be revived. Well, they were wrong. We proved them wrong. In the 1990s, we had a language revitalization, a cultural revitalization that was led by our language. And now we're teaching the language to our people, and we have a variety of ways we teach. We have a language dictionary online, and we have a language learning app that people can use to practice and learn the language. We also have education programs for our young people. Uiuc is a group of camps, among other things, for our young people. And we now have from age 5 to age 18, we have camps. Last year and probably this year, it looks like they're going to be online again. But When we can, we gather them. We have a camp in Oklahoma one week, and another week we have the same camp in Fort Wayne, so that as many of our young people can attend. And they learn about our history, our culture. They learn about who they are as Miami people. And as you see in that top image, they learn how they are connected to each other as Miami people. One of the things that always happens at camp, and in fact, every time we get together for any reason in the summer, we play Peketahamenge lacrosse. We love lacrosse. You may know that lacrosse is a native game originally, most likely originated by the Iroquois, at least that's what they say. And it passed on to us. And we have been playing lacrosse since time immemorial, and we love it. Now you can see in this picture, we don't play quite like the high schools or the college students might play it. No padding, no helmets, sometimes no shoes. We play with men and women, boys and girls, elders and small children. Right there is Chief Langford running to catch that ball in his lacrosse stick, and his grandchildren are out there playing as well. And we play with anybody wants to play. I've seen a game with as many as 200 people on the field at the same time. It's just out there to have fun. Kind of a unique thing for us is that thanks to my colleague who had began to make traditional lacrosse sticks, we now play primarily with traditional lacrosse sticks. In the image, it's a little older, a few years ago, and some people, Chief had the traditional stick, but some people had the more common sticks that are used today. But now almost everybody uses the traditional sticks, and that's a lot of fun to play more the way our ancestors did, except that we play with pinky balls to make it a little safer. They played with wooden balls, so we don't do that. There are other games that we have been playing since time immemorial. One game that we love to play is called Senzawenge. I just learned the other day that some tribes call it Indian dice, and there are various versions that different tribes play, but it is a dice game. Those pieces, they come in different shapes and different kinds of decoration, but you toss them up in the air and they fall in the bowl, and you get points depending on how they fall in the bowl. And the other game is called the Makasina Game, and it was originally played with moccasins. Those mats that are on the ground were originally moccasins, and a pebble would be hidden in one of the moccasins, or today under one of those mats. And the other team, the person on the other team has to find where is the pebble at the right time. And so it gets pretty intense, and there's singing to distract the person from thinking about where it might be. And it's a very fun game. And I love this picture because the two that are playing right there are twins, and you just know they're trying to psych each other out. But that's all part of the game. Both of these games were originally gambling games, but gambling was quite different than we think of it today. If you were going to play, you would bring something that you had extra. Maybe you had an extra pair of moccasins. Maybe you had an extra bow. You would bring that and you would bet it. And then whoever won everything. They won all the prizes. But more importantly, what they won was the right to give gifts. Gift giving is a high value for Miami people. And so whoever won then would redistribute all these objects among the players. So maybe you came with the moccasins, but you go home with the new bow. But it would be something pretty equivalent to what you had bet. But it makes it a little more fun to play it that way. And today we don't gamble. It's primarily young people that are playing. But so we just play for fun. Miami ribbon work is an art that we have been doing since really the early 1800s, 1830s was the peak of ribbon work for us. And a lot of the Great Lakes tribes do ribbon work. But what is unique about Miami ribbon work is that ours are always geometric patterns and always designs with diamonds, diamond-shaped patterns. And you can see there are a variety of ways that you can make diamonds into patterns. And these are done by layering. You put one ribbon down and you fold it, you cut it and fold it and put it down, sew it down, and then you put another one on top of it and you layer them to make those designs. It's a very intricate process. But as you can see, we are starting to learn to do ribbon work again. And where it was traditionally a women's art, today, older women, younger women, young and old men even are learning to do ribbon work. In fact, the first person to revive ribbon work among Miami people was a 12-year-old boy back in the 1990s. So this is an art that we have come to appreciate. I want to talk briefly about consultation with tribes. Generally, consultation we think of as a government to government activity that occurs between tribes and the federal government. But archaeologists get involved in these consultations at times. Particularly, I think about on a data recovery plan. We would consult, and the archaeologist, of course, is integral to that. And also, and then of course, in terms of NAGPRA, archaeologists may at times be involved in that. Consultation should always be with federally recognized tribes who have sovereignty. The Marshall Trilogy of Supreme Court decisions back in the 1820s and 30s defined that tribes are dependent domestic nations. We are sovereign nations. And federal recognition of a tribe means that the US government recognizes the tribe as a sovereign nation. And that's what establishes our right to government consultation. Any interested organization can consult, but not as a tribe. So why does it matter? Why is it important to the tribes? First of all, it is our sovereignty, and it's important to us that we are recognized as sovereign nations. It's part of who we are. But each tribe has a different history, a different culture than the others. And so we each need to represent ourselves. It's important to us because we're talking about our ancestors. We're talking about their places and the objects that they left behind. It's about respect for our tribal beliefs and our practices, about the places where we were and where our ancestors are. Our forced removal means that our ancestors in Indiana and Illinois are far from where the tribe is today. But these homelands are important as a place where we have been for a far longer time than the United States has existed. And our ancestors have become the dust of this land. So it's important that we work together to find the best solution to care for these ancestors and to do it in advance of any project that might have the potential to destroy or even damage what our ancestors have left behind. So my work as Tribal Historic Preservation Officer is about our identity, who we are as a people. It's about our way of life, our unique perspective. It's tied to our language, our stories, our culture, our history. And it's about leaving something behind for the next generations. Mishinewe, thank you very much for listening. And I think we probably have some time for questions.
Hi, Diane. We do have some questions. Thank you so much for that incredible talk you just gave. We have several questions, so I will just jump in if that's okay. First, is there an aspect of Miamiaki history you are interested in researching or would like to research in the future?
Yes, actually, because this is our 175th anniversary of the forced removal, we are working on a commemoration. This is not a celebration by any means, but it's important for us to commemorate what our ancestors experienced 175 years ago. So I have been doing a lot of research on not just the removal, but all the treaties and the treaty negotiations and everything that has led up from 1826 to our removal in 1846. And if you're interested, I have been writing a monthly blog post. If you go to the miamiacenter.org, under research, there's a link to the blog, has a lot of information about the tribe, but these monthly blog posts on the removal are there. And it means a lot to me to be able to understand more clearly what was happening during that removal and why it happened. A lot of the details had been lost. And so I'm trying to recover some of that so that we can all understand and appreciate what happened with our ancestors.
Thank you. I'm not quick enough to find the blog post and post it for everybody, but maybe we can do that after the fact and attach it to the recording.
It's
so
a Miami word, so it's, I actually can't remember it well enough to pronounce it, but.
If anybody out there in the chat land wants to do that and send it to me, then I can share it with everybody. I'll just put that out there. Okay, we have lots of questions rolling in. One is, has archaeology or material culture studies played a role in the language and storytelling revitalization of the Miamiaki?
Not so much. It's more documentary that we've used. The language, our language was so incredibly preserved, even though we weren't speaking it as a language anymore. The Jesuits studied us. Of course, they're interested in conversion, but they studied the people that they wanted to convert, and they recorded our language in extensive dictionaries, and they recorded information about us. And other such sources. Unfortunately, there's not a lot in the archaeological record that helps us, partly because we had really good locations for where we lived. And apparently the Americans thought so too, and they came in and built over our sites. So Kikayonga was a metropolitan area of several villages, and it's all underneath the city of Fort Wayne, if there's anything left now. So it's been very difficult. What we have not seen is archaeological evidence, for example, of us being in Wisconsin. We know we were there. We have documentary evidence, but I would love to see archaeological evidence of we Miami were there. And that may be difficult because in some ways we were similar to the other tribes that were there. But yeah, we would love to see archaeological evidence in places where we were that are not covered over by cities.
Thank you. And everybody, I think I shared the correct link. My co-organizer, Erin Betson, found it for me. So I think we shared it. Teamwork makes the dream work. Okay, next question, and I will admit this question is for me. How has your experience as a librarian informed your work as Tribal Historic Preservation Officer? And are there differences between conducting research with tribal archives versus other archives?
That's a very interesting question. I knew something like that would come when I told you I'd been a librarian. Personally, being a librarian helps with anything I had chosen to do, because there are so many skills that it takes to be a librarian, but also learning that research and learning how to understand research and how to organize research. So that has helped me very much. But yes, it is very different, not as much in the gathering of the information, but in the understanding of the information. Most sources in a library are going to be from a Euro-American perspective. When we look at sources as Tribal Historic Preservation Officer, I'm looking at it from a Miamiaki perspective. What does this say about us, and how does it reflect who we are, and how does it not reflect? How is it inaccurate in what it says about us? And certainly, as a librarian, I always taught the students, you've got to be reading things with a critical eye. What's the background? Who's writing it and why are they writing it? And that applies when I'm reading material as a Miami citizen, as Tribal Historic Preservation Officer. Those resources, I can read and tell you, oh, that person didn't even talk to any Native person when they wrote that book. Or you can see where they've tried to talk to tribes, but maybe they didn't quite get it, or whoa, they got it. They get our perspective. And so that's really the take that I often look at in looking at resources in this job.
Thanks. I think I've got a good follow-up question. How might the stories archaeologists tell be of value to the Miamiaki?
First of all, as I mentioned, those cultural backgrounds, you know, if those could be done in a way that really reflects our history, and looks and looking at what do tribes say about themselves and about their history, and not those sometimes very old secondary sources, to not use those, or at least not use them solely. So that can be beneficial, but also in terms of what I look at archaeological reports, and I can learn about Miami sites. I mean, there are some archaeological, I said there aren't very many, but there are some significant archaeology sites that are Miami sites. And those that there are very valuable because they help us to understand, oh, you know, we didn't have stories that told us exactly where that site was. I would be so thrilled if they could find Sakiweonge, the place of our first village. If archaeology found that, wow, that would be amazing. So our land is not just our villages. What's important to us in the land is not just what is found in one archaeological site. It's far beyond that, because we lived throughout the land, not just in our villages. But learning about those villages can help inform us about our ties to the land and where we were, and in some ways who we were, in different ways than we know now.
Thank Thank you. We're running up on time, but I have one last question, and I actually posed this to Second Chief Poppenfort, and I know you were able to attend his lecture, so I thought it would be nice to pose it to you. And after just speaking about your relationship with the landscape, how can non-native residents of Illinois that are living in the ancestral homelands of the Miamiaki serve as allies to the Miamiaki and other removed tribes?
Consult. Whether it's a federal project, then consultation has to happen. But even if it's not, consult with tribes, talk to us about what you found, talk to us about what you want to do. Talk to us about even things that are not archaeological, but just, we want to have a program related to the tribes. Don't do it on your own. Talk to us. Let us work with you and help you make it better by giving you the information that we have.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing that and all of your knowledge with us today. On behalf of the Office of the Vice Chancellor of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, the Prairie Research Institute, and the Illinois State Archaeological Survey, as well as the Office of the State Archaeologists, thank you to Diane Hunter, and thanks to everyone in the audience for joining us this afternoon and attending. I want to let you know that this lecture was recorded and will be posted on the ISAS YouTube page for further viewing. Before we sign off, I want to point out that our last event in the series is Monday, May 10th at 3 p.m. Central, when we will be hosting Dr. Jane Mount Pleasant, Professor Emeritus in the Department of Horticulture at Cornell University. Thank you everyone so much. Thanks to Diane again, and have a good evening.